We all know that the Utah Jazz were put through the ringer this year, and whether we liked it or not, there was a lot of good, a whole lot of bad, and a really unnecessary amount of ugly involved. Now, for the Utah Jazz faithful, obviously we saw some extreme highs that saw the team look like they were a play-in caliber team to borderline low-seed playoff team towards the trade deadline, but after they were unable to find anybody to consolidate at the trade deadline, they ended up just selling a bunch of pieces and recouping a lot of draft capital in the process, which effectively made the team hot dog water and at the same time allowed us to see what the rookies were capable of doing and what some of the younger guys just simply could put together and give us a true scope of what they would look like going into next season. It made things a little bit difficult for us to bear with as fans of the game, and for specifically Utah Jazz fans, whether you're one of Larry Markkinen, one of Colin Sexton, one of Walker Kessler, or of any particular player on the roster, because quite honestly, the basketball wasn't fun after the trade deadline. In the exit interviews for the end of the season, we saw Danny Ainge and Will Hardy provide some very interesting thoughts when coaxed by reporters to present their opinions on certain topics. Now, obviously, Danny Ainge's interview, if you have not seen it, will be linked in the description below, as will Will Hardy's, but Danny Ainge's was the longer of the two, roughly 40 minutes to Will Hardy's 18, and quite honestly, there was a lot more juicy tidbits in there than I was originally expecting. I watched it and rewatched it to make sure I got all of it, and luckily for us, I have some notes to summarize it for those that don't want to watch. We're going to go through this in a very quick fashion, trying to hit on all the key points, and then I'll have some subsequent videos after this one to go ahead and give a little bit more of a deep dive for specific topics that you guys are wondering about. It's your boy Wraith Hoops. Thanks for tuning in this video. As always, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and become a member to help support the content in the future endeavors that we have. That being said, let's go ahead and get into this one. Now, in Danny Ainge's end of season media availability video, we found that there were some very interesting questions that got hit on, and honestly, Danny Ainge strikes me as a very intelligent individual. Obviously, coming from his original Boston Celtics days, he was the head of the snake that put together some interesting rosters, and while a lot of his feats have come to be more luck-based, and he's even been willing to admit it, even in this interview, things were put in a situation to where he does know to a certain extent what he's talking about, obviously presenting a certain level of hope and dreams that the Utah faithful should have in their roster. He presented some dancing around the question having answers, which I don't necessarily enjoy, because at the same time I do understand as a front office individual and as somebody that's going to be the head of a multi-million-dollar organization, you can only divulge but so much information to reporters and to the fans, but at the same time you'd like to present yourself in a certain way of transparency so that people that do understand what's actually going on can get something to just nibble on. A lot of his answers I found were just, quite honestly, a little bit abysmal, didn't directly answer the question, and a lot of times you would find him at certain situations talking around a point just to come back and say, did I really answer your question? And if you have to ask that question, that means you kind of know what you were doing, in my opinion at least. But let's go ahead and get into it. Now, one of the first questions that was asked was, what are the Jazz looking for going into this offseason? Now, obviously, we knew we lacked wing depth post the trade deadline, obviously with Fontecchio being the best wing that we had on the roster previous to the trade deadline and eventually relinquishing him and sending him down to the Pistons. Danny Ainge had a very interesting response to this. Now, he posed the question back to the reporter and asked him what he thought the Utah Jazz should be looking for, and the reporter obviously gave some solid answers. He said youth, athleticism, length, and defense, and obviously, Danny Ainge agreed. Naturally, we felt like this was a necessary outcome and ultimately something that just makes the most sense for the roster going forward, but it's a little bit of a cop-out in a certain sense, because I would much rather Danny Ainge be the one to go ahead and say that instead of asking the question back to the reporter and then when the reporter says it, saying, yeah, that's a good answer, that's what I was thinking. That's kind of weak in my opinion. A more interesting question that had been asked was how good this draft actually is. Now, for those that don't know about this draft, this has been expected to be one of the more historically weaker drafts in the recent decade, more so because there's not a clear consensus top 5 set of guys that just look like they're going to be surefire franchise alternating pieces. There just seems to be a whole lot of role players, a whole lot of hit and misses, and a whole lot of guys that might have a lot of film but don't have a whole lot of guarantees. Now, Danny Ainge said that this was a tough draft to work with because of this reasoning. Obviously, there being less surefire franchise-altering pieces, in his words specifically, which, to be quite honest, is a very fair assessment. For those that don't know, the Jazz have 3 draft picks in this draft. They feel like they have the ability to go after some very interesting pieces. Obviously, the draft boards have been fluctuating significantly because there are no guarantees with this draft, and obviously the draft lottery is yet to occur, but the Jazz expect to pick somewhere around the 8th and then later on with roughly the 28th and the 32nd pick. In this offseason, the reporters asked what exactly Danny Ainge felt like the Jazz would end up ultimately being in contention to do. This is an important question because going into last season, we thought that the Jazz were going to be bad. But as the season progressed, they ended up putting together a very strong suit of games that saw them go 15-4 at one point and go back above 500 after starting the season at 7-16. Obviously, that's a very big swing, and while there may have been a lot of luck games involved and a lot of injuries to other teams' players that kept them out of games that would have made things much more difficult for us, the team was rolling nevertheless, and Will Hardy had these guys on a tear. After the trade deadline, things fell apart. That allowed the Utah Jazz to maintain their draft pick in the first round this year because it was originally top 10 protected. Danny Ainge specified that they do not plan on having 6 kids under 20. That would not happen to be option A, B, or even C. And while that may still be an option at the end of the road, that's not necessarily what he's aiming for. And quite honestly, that seems to be the less preferred of all options that are on the table going into this offseason. They asked who the Jazz should trade for, and while he didn't give any names, he said that they got very close but missed out around the trade deadline earlier this season, leading us to believe that it could have been a little bit of DeJounte Murray action, or perhaps more of the Mikal Bridges, somebody that was more of a star caliber player, because as Danny Ainge has been known to do, he doesn't want the Jazz to go from a low tier team to a middle of the pack team. He wants to see them jump all the way to the top and have a long, progressive level of longevity that will allow them to be successful for years and years to come. He said specifically he doesn't want the Jazz to go from 23rd, which they look like at the end of this year, up to something like 18th. He wants to see them jump up to 10th to get into that level of playoff contention to where they are title caliber teams. And then as the years go on, they have a healthy window of opportunity to capitalize on the pieces that have been put together, so long as the stars align and everybody can remain healthy. One of the questions that I found to be very interesting that I disliked how Danny Ainge ended up responding to was posed by one reporter when he said, what was the aim of the Jazz in trades and why did they trade the veterans so late last year? Now, he said that going into this offseason, they're going to be big game hunting, which sounds like they're going to be shooting for a superstar, but that also means that it's a very banger bust situation. However, he expanded on this and said that the window of opportunity for the Utah Jazz coming into this offseason would be sooner than 3 to 4 years before they could view themselves as a genuine contender. And he said they have all the way until July trying to win in that situation, and if they are unable to lock down a potential trade that ends up garnering them the opportunity to be a genuine contender, then they'll end up reevaluating their direction another day. That gives us a whole lot and a whole little in a certain way, because he didn't directly answer the question that was revolving around why they ended up trading the pieces so late into last season. He just kind of alluded to the fact that while they were successful, that was never the intention of the team, and quite honestly, they were expected to be mediocre at best. Basically pointing to say that the team wasn't supposed to be good, and since they were good, well, we had to get those guys up out of there. In relation to his big game hunting statement though, it seems like he believes that the Jazz are one really big or 1A option piece away from being a genuine contender, which most fans and most analysts would probably agree with to a certain extent, myself included. I just feel like I don't know how realistic it is that we end up garnering it, though we do have the assets most definitely to make it happen. There's a significant amount of draft capital, and the Jazz are really only outmatched in draft capital by probably the Oklahoma City Thunder because their treasure trove of picks is matched second to none. Now, with him feeling that the level of contention and opportunity is within 4 years, and honestly a little bit less than, that means that the player is going to be a young-ish veteran player that has a high enough level ceiling that may not have exactly reached it yet, but he's borderline right there. He also expresses himself as giving them the window up and through July to determine what their direction is going to be. They want to be a contending team as soon as possible and with the longevity to do it for as long as possible. But if they go into July and they have not yet pulled the trigger on a trade, or teams are hesitant or unwilling to go ahead and work it out with them, then they're probably going to go ahead and just treat it as another rebuilding year and just cultivate the talent that they have and see if there's another piece on the market that they can get just to kind of hold them over and get the guys more acclimated and more experienced to better understand the pieces that they have on the roster like they did at the end of this season, and also put them in position to where the guys will have played in some more meaningful games. Which, again, is the least preferred, to be quite honest, and at that point, you might as well just go into the next season with 620 and under-year-old kids on the roster, because you're not going to win significantly more games and be a significant player in the playoff picture to begin with. An interesting question that has been on the minds of many people, and a question that I have very recently covered in a video, was in regards to Lauri Markkanen. The reporter said, "Are you interested in extending Lauri Markkanen, or do you just want to let it play out?" Danny Ainge, of course, was a little bit interested in this and kind of raised an eyebrow to the question, but he's answered it so many times, he's tactfully come up with a response for it. He said, and I quote, "I just prefer not to talk about that, but I think it's pretty clear that Lauri Markkanen is a very good player. We love him. We'd love to have him around." This answer basically tells us two things. Number one, they like Lauri Markkanen. But on the backside of things, they're not ready to completely commit to Lauri Markkanen. They want to leave out on the table the possibility of trading Lauri Markkanen and dealing him away to another team if the right situation presents itself, which is the correct approach to take, though we all love Lauri Markkanen. We wouldn't want to see him go, and considering the fact that he loves Utah and most stars quite honestly don't have that same love for Utah, particularly considering it's a smaller market team and there's not as much of a particularly enjoyable atmosphere by NBA terms and amongst NBA players. Though there is the many scenic views, and though the area itself is quite lively and enjoyable to watch, most players do prefer to see more sights and have more individual entertainment situations that they can get themselves into, whether it be from a nightlife situation or just doing other things in their day-to-day lives. That being said, it's hard to get guys to fall in love with it, but if Lauri Markkanen has, I would love to keep him for the long term. Since Danny Ainge directly did say that they do love Lauri Markkanen, they understand he's a great player, and they would love to keep him, but he also didn't directly say that we are going to re-sign him, that basically tells us that there have been conversations and there have been a little bit of buzzing in the ear that has told him that certain teams might be willing to go a little bit extra into their pockets to pay a hefty sum to get Lauri. And while Danny Ainge might not end up ultimately picking them, he at least, as a genuine good member of a front office in any organization, should mildly entertain it to understand exactly what the possible ramifications of the situation could be and what the ultimate positives and negatives of a potential Lauri Markkanen trade could look like. Now, during the entirety of this interview, anytime he was asked about the rookies, his focus was always on Keyonte George. He did end up sprinkling a little bit about Taylor Hendricks in there, and Bryce Sensabaugh did get a name drop once, but honestly, Bryce Sensabaugh wasn't much of a talking point for him at all, and Taylor Hendricks even didn't seem like a big guy that he wanted to divulge much information about. It seemed like Keyonte George, obviously being the rookie that had played the most time in the NBA, was more of a focal point of his conversation and answering with the reporters, and just the thing that he felt easiest when responding to. A question that was posed was the growth of the rookies, and he said that Keyonte grew the most. He loved the ups and the downs that he had, and while I might or might not agree/disagree with that, it was ultimately something that is up to him as a front office mate to determine. Along with that, the information has obviously dropped with them making a coaching hire of Avery Bradley, and Keyonte George fervently likes Avery Bradley. Avery Bradley, for those that don't remember, was a big piece for Danny Ainge back in his Boston days. He was known for having the knack for being a really strong defensive presence at the guard position. Obviously, he had high basketball IQ. Obviously, he could score the rock to a certain degree and was a decent enough playmaker, but he was known for making his coin on the defensive side of the ball. He was known for being hard-nosed and being willing to get in there and really get after it. And that's something that Danny Ainge always appreciated. And so adding that to this guard room to kind of push these young guys along and give them a little bit more of a proper influence in that department alongside Chris Dunn's veteran presence on the roster would do wonders as the time goes on. With that being said, though, Danny Ainge said that Avery Bradley doesn't know if he wants to be in the front office or on the coaching side of things, but he will try to do both over the course of this season. That could be a very interesting form of foreshadowing, because that means that he might have a significant presence when it comes to those guys in the locker room, or they might just see him in a passing situation and he might just drop little nuggets of knowledge here and there, but just takes a more managerial route of things. Either way, it will be beneficial to the rookies, but I think him from a coaching standpoint, because of his cerebral basketball intelligence, and particularly from his play style back in his day, could benefit guys like Keyonte George and Bryce Sensabaugh the most going forward. They were asking how often the general manager Zanuck and himself talk to Will Hardy, and he said that they talk on a daily to almost everyday basis, with obviously Zanuck being the one that talks to him literally every day, and then Ainge catching him probably every other day and just having genuinely good conversations. And because of this question, I think that it was a very sneaky question to ask, because you always want to make sure that your coach and your front office are on the same page. If there's any sort of disconnect, then either the coach might end up getting out of there, the front office might be on the hot seat, or there just might be a situation where you find a lot of fans siding with one over the other and finding that other people's jobs might be on the line because the team is ultimately doomed to fail due to the disconnect at hand. Now, he directly said that Keyonte George was the best of the three rookies and that Taylor Hendricks has a ways to go. He also said that Kenneth Lofton and Darius Baisley will play in the Summer League along with Johnny and the other draft picks that they ended up drafting this year to see and get a better understanding of everybody's game. Now, they did play a certain level of games at the NBA level towards the end of the season, especially when they sat Larry Markin and sat Colin Sexton and sat John Collins and Jordan Clarkson, but there's always room for improvement, and as they go into this offseason, they have a solid foundation to continue to build on, and during the Summer League, it would also provide them with a strong opportunity to show what they've grown in from a department standpoint. He did touch on something interesting that a lot of people don't actually know, and while I've covered it in some of my videos, a lot of people still don't know the full length of it. A lot of people expect Keyonte George to be the franchise point guard going forward. And while I'm not necessarily completely in agreement with that, I do understand the desire for it to happen. The one thing that Danny Ainge did bring up and made a point of emphasis for in the interview was saying that Keyonte George played small forward at Baylor. Now, for those that don't remember, Keyonte George ended up weighing as much as 231 pounds at one point. Now, for reference, when he was drafted, he was weighed out at roughly 185 to 187. Which is a drastic change between that 1 year of Baylor and the couple months that he had before his draft workouts, and eventually obviously subsequently being drafted by the Utah Jazz and showing up front and center for those guys. Now, he continued on to say that this is his first year since high school really playing at that point guard position most heavily, and he did a solid job for the most part. He said that he doesn't know if he's a franchise point guard, but he seems to be more comfortable off the ball, which is quite honestly very bluntly true, though I would disagree on one part because it seems like from a three-point shooting standpoint, he shoots better when he dribbles the ball. He shoots better off the step back. He shoots better when he has the opportunity to get into his own shot as opposed to being off the catch. And while that will be a big point of emphasis for him going into the offseason, I believe if he can get that down, it will provide him the opportunity to be maybe not a perfect point guard, but more of a combo guard that can be mixed and matched in different lineups. And even if he does end up seeing a ceiling where he comes off the bench, he could be a more efficient version of what Jordan Clarkson does so well. Later on, he did harp on the fact that Taylor Hendricks had made significant improvements across the season, particularly from a G League standpoint, and then eventually when he was with the NBA roster. But then he also said that he's way behind Keyonte, which I think was very interesting to say because from an offensive standpoint, Keyonte George didn't have a lot of efficiency. He had flashes and he had some very high highs, but he also had some very low lows. And looking at Taylor Hendricks, I think from a defensive standpoint, he was significantly better than Keyonte. Now, he took to certain schemes a lot better on a significantly shorter leash, but across the sample size of games that we saw him, I think that he is the more promising out of the two. It didn't really seem that that was the point of emphasis for Danny Ainge. It didn't seem like he necessarily bought that, but it seemed like he was willing at the very least to say that Taylor Hendricks had some promise and eventually would end up building into a certain type of character that would be worth playing in significant minutes later on down the road. Bryce Sensabaugh was slightly excluded from this conversation, though, which made things a little bit interesting, but he later was brought up when a reporter specifically brought up the name of Bryce Sensabaugh, and he said that Bryce had a better feel for the game than Taylor Hendricks, but he still had much more of a way to go because from a turnover standpoint, from a playmaking standpoint, and more importantly from a defensive standpoint, there was still a lot of growth that was necessary. And he did decide to go ahead and give him a little bit of praise, saying that though his shooting numbers were low this season and his splits were quite honestly abysmal in most games, he is a better shooter than what his numbers presented. It's about him getting comfortable with the game and better understanding where his assignment needs to be and knowing what shots to take and what shots he is not yet prepared to go ahead and hunt down yet. They asked about defense, and obviously the Utah Jazz ended up closing out the season as the 30th ranked defense overall. But he said that ball movement, spacing, and running were all higher emphasized points. And he said that while it is a bit of a personnel issue, well, it is a bit of a coaching issue at the end of the day, it also comes down to what the point of emphasis is for the team on any given night. And you can't emphasize everything. That's not how it works. You can get incrementally better at certain things, but if you expect everything to get better, then you're not going to ultimately see a lot of success because everything is not the easiest to build on. And not everything is complementary of one another. So with specifics, he said that ball movement, spacing, and running were all higher on the list, and therefore defense ended up falling off. And then obviously after the trade deadline, they just lacked the pieces to play defense at a significantly high level, considering the fact that they picked a lot of rookies and a lot of first and second year players overall just to go ahead and get a lot of burn. And that put them in a position to where a lot of your guys just weren't capable of defending the guys that they were assigned to. The effort might have been there on some nights, but they just weren't physically capable of being that successful. Now, he did also provide some very generic praise for Jordan Clarkson when asked what his role would be going into this next season. It didn't seem like he was heavily hinting towards a Jordan Clarkson trade, which I found to be a little bit interesting. But at the same time, it put him into a position where I guess he was just doing his job. And at the same time, he said that Jordan Clarkson's job would be to be a genuine leader, just be a guy that helps push the tempo for guys and helps build guys up and put them in position to be successful for years to come. So yeah, overall, a generic praise for Jordan Clarkson. He slipped in there at the end that Walker Kessler will be playing with the Summer League team, which I found to be a little bit interesting, but we do need to see more Walker Kessler improvement. His first year was really good. His second year was and we need to see him get a little bit of more of a building foundation and see more success in the long term and hopefully see some more minutes next year because goodness gracious, we didn't see enough of the sheriff in town. He openly said that there would be less emphasis in free agency pools because quite honestly, the depth of the pool this year and as of late just hasn't been that deep. He said that the Jazz are either going to make moves from the trade situation or from the draft. One of the two, but from free agency, there's not really much to go off of unless there's a little piece here or there that they think can help hold them over in their aspirations of eventually being a title contending team. And then he harped on one point specifically to close things out for us here, and it was one that I think was very important. He did say that the team did face a lot of teams that had missing star players and also just weren't hitting their strides at certain points during that 15-4 run during that 19-game stretch that saw the team go over 500. But he posed the question, at that time, are we 7-16 or are we 15-4? And I think that's a genuine question. But at the same time, the Jazz were a rolling team. They were a team that had chemistry, and honestly, it was very fun to watch. It brought back that vibe of the early 2020s when you had the Brooklyn Nets team that had D'Angelo Russell, and those guys were just having fun, enjoying basketball, and really playing for each other. And I think that the team lost that as the season went on after the trade deadline, so you kind of don't really know which side of the spectrum you happen to be on. I think that ultimately the Jazz are on the right path, and I do have a very optimistic look on the future, especially after this interview, because while Danny Ainge has made a lot of questionable decisions and a lot of things that from a emotional standpoint I don't necessarily love or agree with, I think that ultimately his heart is in the right place, and as long as his brain isn't washed, despite being as old as he is at this point, he has a little bit more time on the clock to make something shake. However, if we see a situation where 3, 4, 5 years passes and the Jazz are still middling in mediocrity, then it might be time to go ahead and ask the big questions and see if we turn the heat up on the pot that's underneath Danny Ainge. Whether you think he should be in the hot seat or not is entirely up to your discretion. You guys let me know what you think in the comments below. Let me know what you felt about this summary. Let me know if you watched that video or if you watch it now after this video, how you felt I summarized it, and if you think there was anything that I didn't harp on enough. With that being said, it's your boy Ray Hoops. Thanks for tuning in this video. If you made it all the way to the end, go ahead and smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and become a member to help support the content. And as always, good morning, good evening, and good night, no matter where you're on the globe watching. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll catch you guys in the next one.